Good morning. The title of this seminar is A Peek into the Inner World of the Mind's Eye. A peek into the inner world of the mind's eye. A short title would be How We Think. This is a very broad subject, and I'm going to be covering a lot of material. I'll touch briefly on various aspects of how we think. I feel this subject is very relevant for our spiritual walk, for living a godly life and loving others. Most of the biblical references will be toward the end, but I will mention two as we begin. Proverbs 23, verse 7, part A. Proverbs 23, 7, part A. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. 2 Corinthians 10, 5. 2 Corinthians 10, 5. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. I'll be asking a lot of rhetorical questions. I want to trigger your thoughts about this subject. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to share in the discussion time at the end. The topic I'm sharing with you today captured my attention in January 23. In a conversation with John, I mentioned that when I can't recall a word for an object or a person's name, I bring up a visual picture of the object or person, which helps me retrieve the word or name. A day or so later, a video popped up on my YouTube feed about visual thinking. It was an interview with Temple Grandin. She was born in August 1947. As a child, she was diagnosed with autism and did not speak until the age of 3.5. She became a prominent author and speaker on both autism and animal behavior, earning a PhD in 1975. She is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. She made a revolutionary proposal to the meat industry for improving their cattle handling system. This approach ultimately transformed the meat industry and made Grandin one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2010. Her latest book, published in 2022, is Visual Thinking: The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstracts. Through her books and countless public lectures, Grandin has taught us that autism can be a gift, not a disability. This video started my research on how we think. I began asking family and friends, and many of you, and anyone who might be willing to talk to me about how they think. The simplicity of my original question was, do you think in words, pictures, or both? Shortly after asking the first few people, I had to add, or do you think in concepts or associations? We talked about what they thought when I said car and house. The next question was, do you have an internal monologue going on in your head? In other words, do you talk to yourself? These questions sparked some very interesting and exciting conversations. In my small, tiny, informal survey of 40 people, I've been amazed and even shocked by the unique answers within the basic categories of how people generally think. I assumed people thought similar to me, that humans had nearly the same kind of process happening in their mind's eye. I was very wrong. There are strengths and weaknesses in the different ways we think, just as we find in other areas of life. I do believe our internal world of words, pictures, thoughts, and monologues have an impact on our view of the world around us. The uniqueness of how we think reminds me of Psalm 139:14. Psalm 139:14. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth well. The information I found affects how we learn, how we communicate, our relationships, and how we view ourselves. So, when you think, what is that like for you? Do you think mainly in words or pictures? Can you see words or numbers in your mind's eye? Do you see a word, then a picture? Do you remember what you see and forget what you hear, or vice versa? Can you visualize objects from different perspectives? Do you see in color when you are thinking? Do videos play in your mind's eye? Do you know things without being able to explain how or why? Do you think in concepts without seeing words or pictures? Do you file information into mental compartments to think about later? Do you think in associations, how one thing connects to another? Do you dream in color or in video? Next, is there a monologue some or most of the time in your head? Do you talk to yourself internally or out loud? Do you hear your own voice inside your head? Do you have conversations with others in your head? If so, do you hear the other person's voice in those conversations? Are there feelings and images in those conversations? Can you hear music, songs playing in your mind at times? Is it in your voice or someone else's voice? Or maybe you do not have an inner monologue and it's quiet inside your mind's eye. When I say car, what do you think of? Do you see the word car? Do you see a picture of a car? Or maybe a specific car you have now or had in the past? Do you have the concept of a car, but no word or image? What about house? Do you see a house? If so, is it your house? Or maybe where you lived as a child? Or maybe your grandmother's house? Or a child's drawing of a house? Do you see the word or maybe a concept of a general kind of house? Are there feelings associated with house for you? Maybe you think of a home, a place where people love and care for each other. People who think in words may be very surprised that some people think in pictures, and vice versa. An engineer may instantly grasp by looking at a machine how it works, and maybe how to take it apart and reassemble it. He may find it very frustrating to try and describe it to someone who thinks primarily in words and isn't looking at the machine. The person who thinks in words may or may not understand how the machine works from the description the engineer is giving. He may need to see the machine or its parts as they are being described to understand how it works. Now I'm going to elaborate more on what it means to think verbally. Verbal learners mainly think in words rather than pictures, with a sort of internal dialogue. Verbal thought is linear and follows the structure of language. Thinking verbally consists of composing mental sentences, one word at a time, at about the same speed as speech. Thinking in words tends to be more left-brained. It means that inside your head, you speak sentences to yourself describing what you're thinking about. For example, the voice in your head might say, "I wonder why the lights are on downstairs. Maybe my husband went downstairs to get a drink of water." Verbal thinkers are top-down thinkers. They start with a theory and then look for details and data to confirm it. Their solutions to problems and challenges come from theory-driven thinking. What are some things verbal thinkers are good at? Verbal, logical thinkers tend to be good at learning language and have an affinity for words, literature, and speech. They love to make lists and will often memorize things such as bus schedules, stories in alphabetical order, etc. Verbal thinkers make up a large population in schools, and most teachers automatically do their best to explain and teach verbal thinking and processing. They talk about ideas, objects, events, instead of multi-dimensional sensory experiences. Now let's look at visual thinking. Visual thinking is also called visual or spatial learning or picture thinking. The ability to create a picture in the mind's eye is known as mental imagery. It is the phenomenon of thinking through visual processing. One way of describing it is translating the words you hear into a series of pictures. To accomplish this, people who think visually rely on two distinct groups of skills: object visualization and spatial visualization. Object visualization is the ability to picture scenes, things that in our environment, in rich detail and process them holistically. To process holistically means you see the whole thing as one unit. An example would be someone's face. All of the features of a face come together at the same time when you think of a friend's face. Spatial visualization, or thinking, involves several things: visualizing, interpreting, reasoning, using location, distance, direction, relationships, movement, and change in space. Images are generated and processed analytically, part by part. Visual thinkers tend to be very intuitive. They can come to brilliant solutions without being able to tell you how they found them. Like a child solving a math problem, but he can't tell the teacher how he arrived at the solution. The minds of visual thinkers can use associations in their thinking, which is nonlinear. Here are some signs you may be a visual thinker. You have been told you have a photographic memory. Visualizing 3D objects is a cinch for you. You daydream very visually. You can't remember people's faces. You can't remember people's names, but you always remember their faces. You love pie charts, diagrams, and bar graphs because they show information clearly. You want a job that allows you to be creative. You have difficulty expressing your ideas in words. Basically, if you find that seeing things make them easier to understand than having them explained to you, you are a visual thinker. Visual thinkers who are designers and architects can envision and lay out designs for the construction of objects and events. Engineers can implement designs which can be constructed from all of their previously available pieces of experience and information they have available. This results in a new pattern, object, or event. They are bottom-up thinkers. As an example, I have a friend whose wife told me that her husband can create music for a symphony in his mind. He can hear it, and he can write the music for all of the instruments. Individuals who start out as nonverbal thinkers develop verbal language skills, learning words to describe what's in their environment. At the verbal speaking level, they can be as intelligent and articulate as the predominantly verbal thinker. Nonverbal intelligence is important because it enables people to analyze and solve complex problems without relying upon or being limited by language abilities. It is nonverbal intelligence that allows us to think through, plan for, and implement projects. We also use nonverbal intelligence to organize and manage our time and our belongings. Outside the school setting, nonverbal intelligence may be described as common sense. While a person with common sense may or may not score high on a typical standardized test, their common sense offers many benefits in their life. On the other hand, a verbal thinking person who scores high on a standardized test may not have the nonverbal skill to go to the grocery store before the food runs out at home, or to put together a build-it-yourself piece of furniture. These are examples of some of the strengths and weaknesses I mentioned earlier with the different ways that people think. The statistics vary somewhat from different researchers on the estimated number of people who think in the different categories, but I'm including some to give you an idea of the percentages. Visual thinking is common in approximately 60 to 65% of the general population. People who use visual thinking almost to the exclusion of other kinds of thinking, make up a smaller percentage of the population. Research by child development theorist Linda K. Silverman suggests that less than 30% of the population strongly uses visual spatial thinking. Another 15% uses both visual and spatial and thinking in the form of words. About 25% think exclusively in words. Some nonverbal thinkers may be more skilled in thinking in pictures. They remember all that they saw or imagined. And other nonverbal thinkers tend to think best in sound patterns. They remember hearing everything you said or they heard. The speed of picture thinking is nearly incomprehensible. Scientists believe that the brain is able to process images approximately 60,000 times more quickly than it processes a similar amount of written information. As we know, the more graphics on a computer, the more memory and processing speed it needs. That may be true of the human brain. The next aspect of thinking I'm going to discuss is the inner monologue. It can be called your inner voice, your inner dialogue, self-talk, internal speech, or stream of consciousness. It is the voice inside your head that you can hear when you talk to yourself. However, not everyone experiences their thoughts and emotions as a monologue in their head. I'll talk more about that a little later. Have you ever taken a moment to think about the voice in your head that articulates your thoughts and emotions? From working through complex problems to daydreaming, most of us are so used to the sound of our internal voice that we don't even give it a second thought. The one comment that kept popping up when I asked people about their thinking process was, "I never thought about that." And that was mine as well. Research shows that our inner dialogue develops and grows as we age. Children as young as 5 to 7 years are able to utilize an inner voice to process their thoughts and emotions. It was interesting when I asked my younger grandkids some of those questions. Some studies indicate children as young as 18 to 21 months may also be able to use their internal dialogue to better understand language and phonetics. Research is also being done on how we are able to hear inside our heads without having to speak. The most commonly reported use of self-talk is to organize and filter through our thoughts and feelings, but this is not the case for everyone. A small study in 2011 found that the specific reasons why a person uses their inner voice, as well as the frequency of their internal monologue usage, had significant individual differences. Some people reported that they never experienced self-talk, and others utilized this skill up to 75% of the time when they were tested in this area. While most people experience their thoughts as a sort of stream of consciousness of words and dialogue in their minds, those who do not have been reported to experience their thoughts as visualizations, broader concepts, and emotions. What are the benefits of an internal monologue? It may play a role in our working memory, like being able to recall phone numbers or grocery lists. It may help reduce the risk of forgetting information. Many people can have great success remembering information by reading the content either out loud or internally using their inner voice. The same internal voice is also essential for the practice of reading, which, while reading a book silently, we use our internal voice to listen to the words that we are processing. Internal monologue can be used as a self-motivator and provide support during difficult times. So I have a couple examples. Have you ever had the conversation in your head telling yourself you need to exercise and eat better, when the other part of yourself wants to veto that thought in favor of watching TV and eating chips? The other example, maybe someone upset you and the initial thoughts were to yell at the other person. Then different thoughts quickly surface to remind you that wouldn't be helpful nor the right thing to do. So there is a negative flip side to the internal monologue. If the chatter becomes constant and condemning instead of helping us, it can be detrimental to our health. As I mentioned earlier, some people do not have an inner monologue. They also may not be able to see pictures at all or only very dimly in their mind's eye. If this is the case, it's called aphantasia. Aphantasia is a relatively new area of study, so there's a lot of research yet to be done. A 2021 study indicates that people with aphantasia may also experience anhedoralia. Anhedoralia. It's a term used to describe the absence of auditory imagery or the inner voice. The phenomenon was first described by Francis Galton in 1880, but has since remained relatively unstudied. Interest in the phenomenon renewed after a publication of a study in 2015 conducted by a research team led by Professor Adam Zeman of the University of Exeter. They coined the term aphantasia at that time. The name comes from the ancient Greek words a, meaning without, and phantasia, meaning imagination. I personally think this definition is a little confusing. Imagination and imagery are not the same. Having aphantasia does not impair creativity. Another definition of aphantasia is the inability to visualize, otherwise known as image-free thinking. People with aphantasia don't create pictures of familiar objects, people, or places in their mind's eye, not for thoughts, memories, or images of the future. Other professionals in the field classify aphantasia on more of a spectrum, spanning from complete absence to low-level imagery abilities. Depending on the research you look at, 1 to 5% of the population has aphantasia. It's rare but not insignificant. Dr. Julia Simner has aphantasia and has conducted research on this subject. She says even though she can't picture a horse in her mind's eye, she still knows everything about the horse. In a study between aphantasics and a control group, aphantasics were low in both visual and verbal thinking. However, they did not show huge deficits compared to the control group and were typical or even superior in many verbal tests. Tests that compared their memory for color compared to control groups showed no difference. Long-term memory for color was spot on. In short-term memory, having been shown a color from a color spectrum, they were significantly more accurate than the controls. Memory for facts and events were as good as the control group. There were no deficits in spelling and vocabulary. They did score less in face recognition than the controls. Their thinking skills are normal. They just can't visualize what they are thinking about. Scientists aren't sure what causes aphantasia. Aphantasics may be more introverted, so tests have to eliminate this factor to get accurate results. Some people with aphantasia can have vivid visual dreams, while others cannot. That's because the brain processes dreams differently than what we visualize when we are conscious. The average IQ of aphantasics is 115, compared to the 110 score of the general population. While most people who have aphantasia are born with it, others develop it from trauma or a brain injury. I read accounts and heard personal accounts from people I talked to or from people they knew who, after having some type of surgery, woke up to find they no longer had an inner monologue. They could no longer hear music in their head. Their mind's eye was silent. These people are most affected because it changed the internal world of their mind's eye. Here are some examples. A man went in for a routine appendectomy, and when he awoke from the anesthesia, his head was silent. No music, his voice was gone when he thought, and his mind's eye was blank. An architect lost his ability for visual imagery following a PCA type of stroke. A 65-year-old man after undergoing a procedure to open arteries in his heart, during which he probably suffered a minor stroke. His mind's eye went blank. I have a friend who had gastric bypass surgery in her late 30s and lost some of her ability to recall words quickly. Afterward, she took a cognitive test and had an excellent score, but she knew she lost a percentage of her mental ability after the surgery. Another friend of mine had a business contact who had a superior memory. After the first call, the business contact recognized my friend's voice and knew what she generally ordered. After the business contact had gastric bypass surgery, she lost her sharp mental ability and was no longer able to maintain her business. I didn't do a lot of research on how anesthetic affects the brain, but here's some information I did find. It is known that brain fog can last a few hours after surgery. It takes up to a week to completely eliminate the anesthesia from the body. Researchers conclude that middle-aged people have a higher risk of memory loss and cognitive decline after undergoing surgical anesthesia. Cognitive disturbance is commonly observed in elderly patients following surgery and general anesthesia and may have short and long-term outcomes. I also just read an article in the Epoch Times discussing this. They're beginning to see what anesthesia may be doing to our brains and how that is not good. I do want to briefly mention that about 2.5% of the population experience the opposite of aphantasia, which is hyperphantasia. Their mental imagery or mind's eye is extremely realistic, to the point that at times it can be confused with reality. They can have a hard time telling the difference in reality and what they imagined. This next part is from the research of Russell Hurlbert, a psychology professor at the University of Nevada. He has been studying what he calls inner experience for more than 40 years. He says it's the most interesting topic on the planet. He's written 6 books on the topic, including Describing Inner Experience, Proponent Meets Skeptic. He has worked with hundreds of participants. For his research, he gives them each a beeper, and when it goes off approximately 6 random times throughout the day, they have to note what's going on in their minds. He has found that people generally think in 5 ways. Some people experience all of them. He says these are the 5 frequent phenomenon in thinking with lots of variations. The 5 frequent phenomenon in thinking with lots of variations. Number 1, inner speaking or inner monologue, hearing words in your own voice. An example is talking to yourself, hearing your voice or someone else, or audibly recalling a phone number. Number 2, inner seeing or visual imagery in your mind's eye. Thoughts with a visual symbol. For example, picturing a memory or a place you wish you lived. Number 3, feelings. Any strong conscious experience of emotional process. An example would be feeling sad after the death of a loved one. Number 4, sensory awareness. A sensory signal that overwhelms all else. It can be imagined, like thinking of something soft, or paying attention to a sensory aspect of the environment for an unimportant reason. Paying attention to a sensory aspect of the environment for an unimportant reason. An example of that is while hearing someone talk, your attention is drawn to the light reflecting off their glasses. Number 5, unsymbolized thinking. Unsymbolized thinking. No concept, word, or image associated with thoughts. An example would be pouring your morning coffee without telling yourself to. According to Dr. Hurlbert, not many people have an inner monologue 100% of the time, but most do sometimes. He estimates that inner monologue is a frequent thing for 30 to 50% of people. There are very big differences, he said. Some people have absolutely none, and some people have pretty close to 100%. Dr. Hurlbert's work suggests that it's a mistake to ascribe to oneself a definitive cast of thought. Most people he's found don't actually know how they think. Remember, he gave his participants a beeper and they had to note their thoughts when the beeper sounded? Dr. Hurlbert noted that when individuals were asked to describe their minds pre-beeper, they were often wildly off the mark about what they'll report post-beeper. They actually started paying attention to how they think. He said they were prone to make faux generalizations and groundless assertions about how they think. So I understand that how we think is an amazing process, but I do believe we can be aware of the basics of how we think. We know if we can see visual pictures, or see words, or both. Or if we think in concepts. We know if we have an internal monologue and talk to ourselves or not. Most people I interviewed had some type of inner monologue. I thought it might be interesting to share an interview I read about a person without an inner monologue. Olivia Riviera, age 22, said she doesn't have an inner monologue. She first figured it out in 2022 when her coworkers were talking about a visual blog post. Olivia commented, "When I hear that other people have like a constant kind of dialogue and stream in their head, and that when they're doing a task, they'll just be thinking about things the entire time, it actually kind of feels a little overwhelming." So here's some examples of how Olivia thinks. She described her inner thoughts as jot notes. And I looked that up. So jot notes contains a few words or a phrase. It's not a complete sentence. If she was running late for work, she would know she was running late, but wouldn't be thinking, "I'm late, I need to stop sleeping in, I need to go to bed earlier," etc. If she is having a panic attack, her anxiety manifests in more of a physical way, rather than with compulsive, repetitive thoughts. She said, "I'm not telling myself to panic. I never think like that. That feels weird to say. I never address myself." Other times she thinks in a more visual way. When a song pops into her head, she will hear it in the singer's voice. She said not having an inner monologue has been good for her in some ways, because she can block out negative memories or thoughts relatively easily. It has also brought some challenges. She said when she was growing up, her mother often told her to think before she spoke, but she couldn't. She said, "I can be blunt and I can have no filter. Sometimes I say things I shouldn't say. I will say exactly what I am thinking." When asked, her boyfriend said he has an inner monologue and was surprised Olivia doesn't. So next, how does someone who is deaf think? People who are born deaf have never heard spoken speech. The ability to hear words influences whether someone thinks in words or pictures. The primary method for deaf people to process language is through visual forms of communication. They are more likely to think in images. These images may be of pictures or objects, or they may involve seeing word signs, such as sign language, or seeing moving lips, such as with lip reading. For a person who was not born deaf but became deaf later, they may also have auditory thoughts or words intertwined with their perceptions. There is evidence to suggest that the brain responds to the perception and production of sign language in deaf people the same way it responds to the perception and production of speech in people who are able to hear. What about someone who is born blind? Blind people can remember speech better than sighted people, and a person's ability to see makes no difference in how they remember sound effects. People who are born blind and are able to hear show an advantage with verbal memory. Blind people can use language as a mental tool to remember information. On a daily basis, blind people use their memory much more to remember things, while sighted people can rely on visual clues to recall information. Paul Gabius, age 60, is an associate professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia. He became blind shortly after being born prematurely. He conducts research and perceptual cognitive aspect on He conducts research on perceptual and cognitive aspects of blindness. His personal and professional experience leads him to believe that the brains of blind people work around the lack of visual information and find other ways to achieve the same vitally important result. And that result is a detailed 3D map of space. He has no trouble perceiving the table next to him. He says, "My image of the table is exactly the same as the table. It has height, depth, width, texture. I can picture the whole thing all at once. It just has no color." Gabius, like many blind people, builds pictures using his sense of touch and by listening to the echoes of clicks of his tongue and taps of his cane as these sounds bounce off objects in his surroundings. This technique is called echolocation. There's plenty of imagery that goes on all the time in blind people, he says. It just isn't visual. I didn't look at research on how people think who are both blind and deaf, but I want to read this quote from Helen Keller. "Before my teacher came to me, I did not know that I am. I lived in a world that was a no world. I cannot hope to describe adequately that unconscious yet conscious time of nothingness. Since I had no power of thought, I did not compare one mental state with another." How wonderful someone was able to teach her and help her find and organize her inner world. Recently, I was talking to Kevin Thoney about how he thinks. He brought up an aspect of thinking I had not thought about, and that's how we view time. I'll briefly mention some of the various ways we can view time. Circular, we go through the 4 seasons and start all over again. Linear, has a beginning and an end. We can see time as a resource. It can be activity-based. We may view it like a calendar or pages in a planner, or past, present, and future. Some research indicates our internal clocks may even tick at different rates. Time seems to fly by faster when we get older. There's a reason why we may feel like the years move slowly when we were a kid, but zoom by faster as we age. Experts say our perception of time greatly changes as we age, which makes certain periods feel like they go by more quickly. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next part. I want to briefly mention an area of study that's helpful for brain development and thinking. That's cursive writing. Cursive writing is not only good for the speed of writing, but it also is shown to improve brain development in the areas of thinking, language, and working memory. Cursive writing stimulates brain synapse and synchronicity between the left and right hemispheres, something absent from printing and typing. A study in the Journal of Academic Therapy concluded that first graders who learned to write in cursive received higher scores in reading words and in spelling than a comparable group who learned to print only. So just some food for thought. I looked for studies that described if men and women think differently as far as visually, verbally, etc. Now, we all know men and women think differently, but are they different in how they process their inner world? Well, I don't have an answer. What little research I did find was somewhat complicated to try and explain, so that will be very interesting research when scientists look into that further and make it understandable what they've found. There's another area of how people think I'll mention that creates a lot of frustration, and that's giving and receiving directions. Some people want a map, street names, exact miles, and exit numbers. Some people give directions by landmarks and approximate distances. For example, go approximately 2 miles to the cross street and turn right, just past where the Conoco gas station used to be. Go another mile or mile and a half and you will see a red barn on the left. A half mile past the red barn, you will see a white house with green shutters at the top of the hill on the right. To keep the peace, we need to ask how some process directions and do our best to give them as clearly as possible to the person asking. Sometimes a GPS can have value. Individuals and families may process their thoughts very differently. That's the case with my family. John thinks more in concepts. Amity also thinks more in concepts, like John, and they have other similarities as well. Angie can see pictures, but not words. She can think in concepts and has an inner monologue. Andrea sees pictures, words, and videos. She has somewhat of a photographic memory. Adam thinks in connections and associations. He sees information connected like a spider web. He can see it. He can see numbers, but rarely words. I think in pictures, video, words, numbers, and sometimes I think in concepts. I have a pretty consistent monologue, which on occasion bubbles over into talking out loud to myself. As I was preparing this seminar, I recalled a movie I saw in black and white at a neighbor's house when I was younger than 10. We didn't have a TV at the time, so this movie was very interesting to me. It was about a black panther that killed a person. It didn't show the scene, but even in black and white, the blood ran under the door, making it obvious what had happened. I have been extremely fearful of large cats after seeing that movie. That scene is still vivid in my memory. When I watch any type of movie or real-life negative events, they stay in my head a long time. I can feel what the actors are portraying or the real person is feeling as if it's happening to me. I have to be careful what I watch or hear. Now that I'm a little more aware of how I think, I'm using the information to improve my life in certain areas. I am overly concerned about making sure doors are locked and the garage door stays down when I push the button. Part of the problem is that my mind is on something else, and I'm not focused on what I'm doing. Now I'm making mental snapshots of these situations, so I can look back into my mind's eye to know I locked the door without having to recheck. People have told me stories during our discussions of how they think, of being made to feel dumb or less than others because they couldn't understand math or other information the way it was being taught. Not because they really are dumb, but because they needed the information presented in a different format. We had a family friend who was extremely smart and had a high IQ. He could build or fix anything. However, if you looked at how he spelled words, he seemed uneducated. Now I want to connect some aspects of this information with our spiritual walk. Psalm 119:73. Psalm 119:73. Thy hands have made and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn thy commands. Isaiah 44:2, Part A. Isaiah 44:2, Part A. Thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you from the womb and will help you. Isaiah 64:8. Isaiah 64:8. Yet, O Lord, thou art our potter. We are all the work of thy hand. Matthew 10:29 through 31. Matthew 10:29 through 31. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father's will? But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. I want to remind us with these verses that God knows us completely. He loves us beyond measure. As I began asking people how they think, it became so very obvious how unique each person is. While how we think falls into a smaller number of categories, we each have fascinating variations within those categories. I saw a principle in 2 Corinthians 10:12, Part B. 2 Corinthians 10:12, Part B. As I was preparing this seminar, while it may not be the original point of the passage, for me this principle can apply to how we think. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, Part B. But they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. We are unique, and that makes it hard to compare ourselves with another. I've also found that many people have low self-esteem. This can cause a person to be afraid of using the talents and gifts they have. I hear people being very critical of themselves. If we could accept that we are each a unique creation of God with our own gifts to share, we could begin to live, work, and serve others from our strengths. In 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 6, 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 6, now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of working, but it is the same God who inspires them all in everyone. I'm going to summarize 1 Corinthians 12, 12 through 26 with segments from different verses. 1 Corinthians 12, 12 through 26. Verse 12, part A, there is one body, but it has many parts. Verse 13b, we are all given the same Spirit to drink. Verse 18, God has placed each part in the body just as he wanted it to be. Verse 19, if all the parts were the same, how could there be a body? Verse 28, part B, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are the ones we can't do without. Verse 25, in that way, the parts of the body will not take sides. All of them will take care of one another. Verse 26, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part shares in its glory. Anytime we are around others, there are lots of chances to offend and be offended. When we are able to give people the benefit of the doubt, there is less offense. The more we understand and know the intentions of others, we can overlook minor hurts, knowing that the other person would not hurt us on purpose. I hope this information on how differently we think can help us be more understanding and less offended by others. If someone doesn't seem to have a filter, maybe it's because they process information differently. If we feel hurt by a comment, we can tell the person, your words stung a little, and ask, is that how you meant it? For me, understanding how differently people think gives me pause to be less bothered by perceived slight from another person. Romans 12, 16 through 18. Romans 12, 16 through 18. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty. Give yourself to humble tasks. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Knowing the basics of how we think and how those close to us think can help us have better communication. Maybe we can begin to understand each other on a different level. We are all valuable to God as his children. I hope we can take this information and internalize how unique we are. We all have special gifts. Even if we aren't sure what they are, we can take something we are good at and use it in service to others. We can emphasize our strengths. Embrace how God made you. Use whatever abilities you have to do righteous things, to bring joy to others, to light up your own life, and reflect the light of God to the world. Thank you. So now we'll open it up for comments. John.
Have the school systems started to implement some of these techniques into learning what the children, how the children are thinking, so they can teach them down the direct lines of what they're thinking? Maybe even separate them into classes that where the teacher is on the same level, same thinking process as the students, so they can teach the students better and faster.
Diane and Cynthia, do you guys have any comments for that?
So, a book was written probably 35 years ago, How They Think, and basically the thought is a lot of times kids will learn either verbally, visually, auditorially, kinesthetically, which is big actions, or tactilely, and the most effective way to teach is to try to incorporate as many of those modalities as possible.
Yeah, so that you do the scatter approach because all the kids are thinking differently.
Because
Well-
you gain so much from each other. What one kid will ask in a classroom can spark a discussion that benefits somebody else. So that the more that you can get them actively involved in their education, the better. The worst possible form of education is the teacher standing up there and lecturing, because you're relying on someone to be an auditory learner, and very few are.
Did you have any comments, Diane?
I think that the biggest disservice that public education did for a long time was exactly that. They just lectured. There was so little knowledge shared about the different ways that kids learn. And it's not just kids, it's everybody. Everyone has their own learning style, and often they will overlap. But if you just get up there and talk, or just say, do this worksheet, you're not really teaching, and therefore they're not really learning. So you can have kids all over, your classroom that have so many different needs and ways that they can learn best. It can be exhausting for somebody in the classroom, especially if you're really focused on wanting them to be the best learner that they can be.
Thank you. Jeannie?
It was interesting when you mentioned the connectivity with cursive writing, because they took that out of schools. And they put it back in for a short time with Naomi, so she knows cursive and her brother doesn't. And there's just this huge gap in his learning because he only prints. He can't even read cursive.
Oh, wow.
So I thought that was really interesting.
Ron?
And my question was about cursive writing too. Is there any indication of why it benefits the brain of children to learn cursive writing?
Well, the one thing is that it brings the left and right brain together, coordinates that, but I didn't go into anything in depth on that. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Jeannie?
I think it would be hard to classify any individual in here that we had one certain thing. I think maybe my strongest is my internal conversation with myself all the time. I mean, it's not 70%, it's probably 99.9. But I wanted to bring up that probably that reason is because of the way I grew up. I learned to rely on my own conversations. I moved so many times. I didn't have the ability to have friends that I could turn to. When I think about this, and I'm not thinking of it as a hardship, this is how I coped, is I talk to myself, or I talk to God all the time. And I found myself in my older age doing more conversations with Yahweh than I do anybody else. But I think that's because I've always had this inner conversation going on. In fact, it's kind of funny when I would try to tackle a problem at work and I was trying to balance a month spreadsheet, when we do our general ledger close, and I'd be off $1 million compared to what they had, and then I had to find it. And I'd work on it all day long and just try to tell every piece of paper, where did we do a journal entry wrong, and so forth. And I'd go home, and I'd be halfway home, and I'd be talking to myself and not even realizing I was still on that subject. And, that's the problem. I'd go in the next morning and solve it. Because I didn't rely on my inner conversation while I was at work. I was too honed in on trying to find the numbers, trying to find what happened here, and so forth. But all of a sudden, just talking to myself in a relaxed situation, I found it.
Mhm.
And that happened many times. So I think that we all have strengths in other areas at different times.
Mhm.
But we can probably hone in on what is our major one.
Yeah. Anyone else? Diane?
So I remember us talking so much about the inner monologue,
Mm-hmm.
because I was so shocked that somebody didn't have one. I
Uh-huh.
remember calling you and saying, this is really bothering me. How can you not have an inner monologue? And so you talked me off the ledge about that. But I have really thought about it so much, and it really struck me at the feast this year because I could feel myself on overload.
Mhm.
And what was happening was that I was cognizant of not having quiet time for my inner monologue, my dialogue. I was so overwhelmed by all of this outside conversation and, you know, creating relationships with everybody. I just needed quiet time to just filter and analyze and process it all. And I remember thinking, I would not even be aware of this if Shirley hadn't said something about it. So I didn't really blame you.
Thank you.
But I was so glad that you had even brought it to our attention, because it really is important to me, I'm finding,
Mhm.
to just get away and have quiet time just to sort through it all.
Mhm.
And then I'm okay. But I just start to feel like, you know, that little word cloud, that dialogue cloud above my head, it was all jumbled. And I just needed time to sort it all out and put it all back together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I feel that way too, that when things are so intense and I can just get away, then I can process it. Otherwise, it feels overwhelming if you can't sort it all out. Yes, Jim?
I got a question. You know, I remember this about halfway here, and I thought, I don't know. But now, is there some sort of advantage, because we all that are older learn cursive, is there some sort of advantage? Because nothing, books, road signs, magazines, nothing's in cursive writing. Is there some sort of advantage to it that I don't know about?
Well, there some, just from memory, the research that I mentioned, that kids do better in certain skills if they've had cursive writing. And when you just print or type, it doesn't connect both sides of the brain like writing does. And so it makes your brain work, and it's just healthy for the brain. I'm sure there's a lot more to
Is
it.
it faster? Does it tend to be
It is faster than printing, from what I read. But, yeah, there is an advantage, but I don't have a list of all the advantages of it, so,
Okay, I just wondered.
Yeah.
I never thought about it before.
Mhm.
You know,
We were all
you
just
do
taught.
neural pathways when you're doing cursive writing for understanding what the words are and putting the letters together in different ways. It is developing neural pathways, and you do it so much every time you wrote that those are hardwired into your brain from seeing words in cursive writing, and of course making the transition from that into printed writing. It all just coalesces together into more neural pathways to understand words, you know. And so there is an advantage of it, putting it into your brain in a different way. And you're actually doing it with your hands, which is also part of the neural pathways that's hardwiring into your brain. So you do that so much when you're actually doing that, writing your papers or homework and all that, or just writing letters, you know. You've done it so many times, it's hardwired in there. Everyone here that's learned cursive writing could just jump in and start cursive writing. You don't have to think about changing that A into this typeface A. You know, you just know how to do it. You know, it's all hardwired in. And so you see the letters in print, you can see it in cursive writing when you learned it well. Because everything's in there for both ways to bring the information in. And so, yeah, it makes it's hardwired it all into your brain and develop a new way of looking at words.
okay.
I was just thinking about, as I was growing up, I hated printing because it slowed me down. slowed my process of thinking down. And I took notes on everything. I've always been that way. But when I learned how to write, that was such a great feeling to have some freedom that I could actually apply that and keep a connection with what was going on and making the notes. But when I learned how to type, I can type 110 words a minute. And when I learned how to type, that's when, and I'm just sitting here thinking, it must have some connectivity about how you process that, because the faster you can process it and continue. I take notes when I was at work. My boss would come over and I want you to do this. I'd sit here and type it out because it was faster and I could read it later on. So he'd go, what are you doing? I'm taking notes. You told me you want all these things done, and he'd just blurt them off. I'd sit there and type a little note to myself. And when I'm thinking back on it, it was because you're taking the notes as fast as you're thinking it or you're hearing it, and therefore you're able to process it. So I got to be such a good typist that I typed all these applications for certification to expand the hospital and so forth. And they would be hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And I could tell them what page it was on when they wanted to make a correction.
Wow.
So I'm really thinking that it might have more to do with the speed of being able, if you're a person that has to take notes, like me and Diane, to me, the best part was when I typed. But it was still an increase whenever I was able to write rather than, and I took shorthand too. So that was also a benefit,
Right. Okay, anyone else? Okay, guess we're finished.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
Shirley.